Welcome to Unpicking Dissonance, a podcast brought to you by the Leeds UK music collective known as Fold. I am Seth Mowshowitz. I'm the founder of Fold and the host of this podcast. If you're new to this podcast, our purpose is to explore different people's experiences of cognitive dissonance in relation to the world that is presented to us by mainstream narratives, mainstream culture, our institutions, the world that by and large tends to serve the agendas of entrenched power structures and the elite class, that world that those power structures want you to believe in, that they want you to live in and adhere to as closely as possible, that weighed against your own experience of reality, shaped by your lived experiences, by all the data points that you've gathered throughout the course of a lifetime, everything that you've observed yourself and processed yourself, and the cognitive dissonance of those two realities not matching, not marrying up with one another. And we believe that everyone experiences this to greater and lesser degrees, and everybody responds differently. Everyone copes differently. Each of our realities is entirely unique and is shaped by many, many factors throughout the course of a lifetime. Our own characters and unique experiences, etc. So our purpose here is to gather as many of those unique perspectives as possible, share each other's experience of unpicking the cognitive dissonance, and overlaying them to form a more coherent map of our shared reality and reach a sort of consensus about how things really work, how our world functions, how to arrive at a future that we would like to live in. So the journey is a long one. It's lifelong, and it begins early on. Our first experiences of cognitive dissonance could occur in childhood. Could be something like not wanting to go to school, and your parents, who say they love you, who for all the world appear to love you, send you to this horrible school, this place that you don't want to go, and you make it very clear, you kick and scream, and you absolutely don't want to be there. And these people who love you force you to go. That could be your first almost conscious, subconscious experience of cognitive dissonance. These people love me, but they're doing something that makes it appear they don't. How do I reconcile those two things? And it is a constant, ongoing process. The dissonance is always there to varying degrees, and we develop different kinds of coping mechanisms. But there are certain moments where there could be a real shift, where there could be a sudden leap forward, in a sense, of understanding, where a lot of things suddenly come into resolution, where certain clarity is achieved. I'll refer to these as pivotal moments, for lack of a better term. It could be called awakenings, or reckonings, or epiphanies, or something like that. But I'll call them pivotal moments for now, because that works for me. Now, of course, the plan is to discuss this with other people, but in these first few episodes, I'm relating my own experiences in my own way to start to shape and formulate how these conversations will work going forward, in my own head at the very least. So for me, whenever I think of what were pivotal moments in my life, I think immediately of two in particular. And they have a sort of fuzzy relationship. And even though they're very far apart and seemingly unrelated, they do have a certain strange synchronicity. The first of these occurred when I was a teenager, and the second occurred in the year 2001, when I was 23. But before I get into those, the real beginnings of my own journey into cognitive dissonance began much earlier than these two periods in my life. I come from a fairly free-thinking family background. My parents were both academics who took advantage of international freedom. They moved around a lot. They had friends all over the world, and they liked to go and visit these friends. And we even moved to different countries when I was very little. And then later again, because we had these relationships and went on holiday in different countries. This was unusual for Americans, even at the time, but especially now, more so now. And so I had a very multicultural, international kind of upbringing. And it sort of empowered me to be able to choose between places. And I gravitated towards the Netherlands in particular, because we had really strong friendships there. And I just liked it. I loved being in Europe in general, but the Netherlands in particular. So I pushed for, we had spent one summer there in the late 80s, and I pushed for the possibility of moving there, say for a year. Let's move to Holland for a year. Come on. Then I did manage to convince my parents had already done that before, so for them it wasn't too crazy, and they were in a position to do it, so we did it. I then moved into an international school, and that experience in and of itself was foundational for me. It was a totally different experience. I hated the American school system. I hated being there. I didn't get on very well. I was bullied. I was a sensitive kid, and I just didn't feel like I was well seen or well understood. I remember having to pledge allegiance to the American flag every morning in primary school, and I absolutely hated that. It gave me the ick. I didn't know why, but I knew it wasn't right. I knew there was something weird behind that. So within my family, it was okay to think differently. It was accepted, and it was kind of celebrated, really, because that was just natural to all of us. We all were critical thinkers, and we were encouraged to ask questions to a certain degree. To a larger extent, I think, than most of my peers or, well, just most of society in general. It was an extraordinarily free environment in terms of accepting individuality. Then again, this was a time also when there was very little understanding of neurodiversity, and a lot of people walked around with unsupported needs, myself included, my brother, probably both of my parents, an awful lot of people, most neurodivergent people who didn't present in such obvious ways, most likely fell between the cracks, and if they were unlucky and didn't have a supportive family, a loving family, a caring environment, they were very likely to find themselves in a lot of trouble very quickly, or on a slippery slope, or addicted to drugs, etc. But I was fortunate. Of course, I must also point out that I had an awful lot of privilege growing up. This was a time when there was the middle class was doing very, very well in the United States and in a lot of Western countries. There was a lot more wealth to go around, and it was a relatively stable time. I did not want for anything. I didn't have to have jobs myself. I delivered papers and stuff, but for a little bit of extra cash, I made a little extra cash around, I mowed lawns and stuff, but I didn't really have to be completely financially independent until after university. My university was paid for, so I sure did enjoy a lot of privilege, and I'm a white male, so I mean, probably, one of the most privileged demographics there is. So that does afford you a certain amount of freedom to think differently and to puts you in a better position to ask questions. So I was already in many ways at a real advantage over a lot of other groups. But at the same time, my parents were very free thinking and very forward thinking. And my family modeled multiculturalism and acceptance and celebrating diversity and celebrating difference. So they were exceptional people, I would say. And I gravitated towards other people who lived a similar lifestyle and who lived those values and sort of understood them and demonstrated them and were, just accepting. So all this set me up from an early age to be able to have a sense that something wasn't right, broadly speaking, and a sense that there were forces that were trying to get me to think in very particular ways along particular lines. And along the way, anything that resisted those narratives, I wasn't calling them that then, but I had a sense of this. It was very vague. I gravitated towards the concept that money was the root of all evil. I remember kind of coming to that realization in a profound way. I guess that was an early pivotal moment, a momentous epiphany or something, and that there was a deception happening, that there was a facade, that a lot of mainstream culture, a lot of what I was seeing around me, the way that people wanted me to, it was a great effort to try and get most people to conform. And this is very typical in society, right? But I felt like there was something sinister behind it. And throughout the 1980s, all the things that I was into were countercultural. I was 10 years old listening to Sonic Youth and the Dead Kennedys. The Dead Kennedys were a huge influence on me. They provided a kind of answer to a lot of the cognitive dissonance I was experiencing with that facade, with there being that facade, and the Dead Kennedys railed against all of that and exposed and highlighted many, many things. God bless Jello Biafra. He had a profound influence on me and my way of thinking, my way of understanding the United States in particular. This was the groundwork for what was to come. Along the way, I also had an exceptionally forward-thinking fifth grade teacher, I remember, Miss Barron, who exposed us in a very three-dimensional way to the civil rights movement and tried to expose us to different cultures and give greater representation to marginalized groups. She showed us films of the civil rights movement and lynchings and things, and this was fifth grade, and it was quite heavy, but I'm glad she did. It really brought to light a lot of the disparities in our culture. And I remember at the time, my friendship group was very, very mixed. My closest friends were mostly Hispanic. One guy was from the Dominican Republic. His mother was Hispanic, was Latina, and his father was Afro-Caribbean. I remember his father he was a taxi driver, and he got shot, and he nearly died. Luckily, he survived, but he'd been shot from the back, in his taxi. We were in sixth grade, I think. I remember how traumatic that was. It's just awful. They were such lovely, lovely people. And that was my buddy Sam. He looked after me. He was much taller than me. I was a sensitive kid. He was actually quite a sensitive soul himself. We both drew a lot. We were artists. He was a really talented artist, really into comics. We were drawing Wolverine. And his family was poorer than mine. Like most of my friends' families had a little bit less. And then there were some who had considerably more. And I did notice that the ones who had less tended to be just not white. And the ones who tended to have more were white, Caucasian, if you will. Yeah, another close friend of mine was from Peru. Another one's from Puerto Rico. So, yeah, I had this very multicultural friendship group already. Although we were all American, of course, and we saw ourselves that way. They did have a certain amount of pride in their heritage. And every time I went to their houses, their families were really open about it and very welcoming. And again, this set up a pattern for later, things that happened later. So I was very lucky, and early on that shaped who I was, that sense of multiculturalism and acceptance and celebrating difference and diversity. I saw how beautiful that was. Even in the United States, I could see it. I could see it really clearly from a very early age. Anything that tried to do away with that or demonize it or vilify it or minimize it, I instinctively railed against myself. I disliked it. I didn't understand why. Actually, the elementary school, or primary school as they call it here in the UK, that I went to was really excellent, I have to say, in retrospect. Not only my fifth grade teacher, who I remember very, very well, my sixth grade teacher also. It was in the curriculum. We studied the Bolsheviks, the communist revolution. I remember being a lawyer. I got selected to be a lawyer in a mock trial where I had to defend Socrates. And I was a fairly shy kid in some respects. I wasn't. This was, again, this is the undiagnosed autism. It wasn't that I was necessarily shy, but I could miss social cues, and I had bandwidth processing limitations due to my sensory profile. So none of that was understood. I didn't understand it. But at the same time, I love people, and I love debates, and I love discussions, and a productive discussion, an open discussion. I love hearing other people's perspectives and integrating them with my own and learning from people. And I was lucky enough to be in a school, even in the U.S., that my primary school, not my secondary school, or middle school it was called. I only spent 1 year there, and I hated it. And I knew I was going to hate it because a lot of the what you now call the manosphere stuff kicked in, the toxic masculinity stuff that wasn't so prominent in primary school, although it was there for sure, really took over in secondary school. And there was just no space. There was no space for sensitivity or a person like me. And I knew I was going to be living on the fringe of culture for the rest of my life if I'd stayed there. And I knew I was going to have a fairly hellish time in high school. And I really didn't want that. So for me, that was a big motivation to push my family to move to Holland. I saw an opportunity there. I was like, hey, I don't have to put up with this. We could move to Holland. It could just come, I'll get him to go for a year and then we'll stay longer. And that's exactly what happened. I ended up staying. I was there from 1990 and came back to New York for university in 96. So arrived the summer of 1990, saw my first World Cup on TV, never looked back. I remember it vividly. I was glued to the TV and I just loved being in Holland. I was like, oh my God, I'm so happy. it was a familiar enough culture to me because we'd visited so many times and we had so many friends there. So I was a pig in shit. I was so happy. And I started, with some trepidation, I started international school the following September 1990. And immediately fell into that like a house on fire. It was the best time of my life, really, those years in that school. And that was largely because I found my tribe. And somehow I'd fallen into a community that was so supportive, that understood me so well, that I was just able to thrive, really thrive, but only as long as I was in that community. And in the first couple of years, I didn't think about it, but as time ticked on and came to the final couple of years, I was really starting to worry because I knew it would end. I knew it was coming to an end, and I had no idea what life was going to be like beyond that. I just knew that these circumstances, the place that we were living in, particularly Leiden in Holland, which is an amazing, beautiful city. The school was just outside of it, and I lived in Leiden for most of that time. I was so lucky. It's like, this is the 90s in the Netherlands. It was probably the best time in the history of the world, I think, maybe. Just, for ordinary life. I cannot now imagine a better life. I don't care for wealth and luxuries and, none of that really matters to me. If I could get that time back, and not just the time, if I could get those people in that place back again somehow, I've always been trying to recreate it ever since, but have, unsuccessfully. You can't recreate, you can't create something like that. In today's world, you just have to fall into it. You have to get really lucky. I guess there's some things you can do to try and facilitate it, but you just have to get really lucky, and I was. And in that time, I was in such a good place that my heart was open. I was living 100% of the time. I was awake and alive and open to all experiences. And it was a perfect time to fall in love. And I did. I met this girl whose family were from Chile. And this is pivotal moment, momentous event, momentous period number one. Meeting her and meeting her family and becoming not part of the family, temporarily part of the family, shaped and changed the way that I think about the world profoundly. And it resolved a lot of the cognitive dissonance, particularly around geopolitics and the role of the United States in global politics. So without disclosing any sort of personal information, her family lived through, in a very big way, the September 11th, 1973 coup of President Salvador Allende in Chile, the socialist president who was overthrown and replaced by the dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet. So my girlfriend's father had been a professor of agriculture, and when Allende came to power, he became part of the Ministry of Agriculture and was among those involved in expropriating land from wealthy landowners as part of the sort of redistribution of wealth under Allende's socialist administration. If I get any of these details wrong, I apologize. It's been about 30 years since this happened, so, this is all from memory. Yeah, so her father, because he'd been involved in this expropriation of land, he was marked when Pinochet took over. Anyone who was allied with Allende in any way was targeted. A lot of people were murdered, disappeared, thousands. And, there are some horrific stories. And fortunately, her family were able to flee. They literally, as the story went, I believe, they had to sort of hop fences and run to an airplane. And they escaped, in a nick of time by the skin of their teeth type of thing, and came to the Netherlands, which is, an internationally famous place for agriculture, for, the sort of academic side and the practical side meeting in one place. And apparently quite a few people from Chile ended up in the Netherlands for that reason and for other reasons, and formed a little community there. These are things you would just never know unless you happen to be part of that community or you were lucky enough to tap into it. So they were doing very well. My girlfriend had grown up there, and their family were amazing. They were just amazing people. Her mother had stories about hanging out with the Cuban revolutionaries, and she'd met Silvio Rodriguez, the great singer-songwriter, who I will link to in the show notes because a lot of you probably won't have heard of him. He's kind of almost like a Bob Dylan figure for South America. Well, for Latin America, I should say. He's Cuban. But just, these incredible stories. And for those who don't know, the coup against Allende was a CIA-backed coup. The CIA were involved in an awful lot of these coups. And the reason was that Chile is a huge mining country, and there were very large U.S. mining interests, these multinational corporations, Anaconda, I think it was called at the time, hugely powerful corporations who had an awful lot of investment in the Chilean mining industry, which is, of course, not right when you think about it. These U.S. companies extract enormous amounts of wealth from a country, don't return it. The people of Chile didn't get much out of that. They would just work in the mines for minimal remuneration and in not great conditions. This is a very typical picture, and this happened and happens all across South America, Latin America. And Allende was standing up to it. He said, no, we're going to nationalize these industries so that the people of Chile benefit in a very sensible and rightful way. And for this, he was assassinated, and thousands of others along with him. And the average person on the street is not going to know about this in the first instance, and if they did, they wouldn't know that the U.S. had anything to do with it. They wouldn't know about the CIA backing. These are the things I learned from my girlfriend's family. They took a gringo into their home who had fallen in love with their daughter. You got to imagine this. These people who had fled a CIA-backed coup in Chile had to upend their lives and move halfway across the world. And then this 15-year-old white middle-class American ass kid comes bouncing into their house, professing his love for their daughter. And, what would you do? I can only imagine. And they were so beautiful. They were so cool about it all. They sized me up. And they realized, because thankfully I'd had that multicultural, free-thinking kind of upbringing, and I was in a place where I was open, I hadn't been indoctrinated in the way that they would rightly have expected, because, most of the North American people they would have encountered would have been fully indoctrinated. It's not everybody who is fortunate enough to be able to grow up without that, or to resist it, or to just have the sort of the natural tendency to resist it. So they spotted that in me, and they thought, well, this is me reading into it, but, I think they saw it as an opportunity to educate me, to put a person out there in the world who came from this heavily indoctrinated imperialist nation, and sort of send them back out into the world with a clearer, more three-dimensional picture of reality. And it was this that really resolved so many things in my mind, because I had suspicions of a lot of these things. I didn't know anything about U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. On the one hand, it was shocking to hear about the details of it. And because, it sort of comes out of nowhere, those things had happened. At that point, it was 20-something years since it happened. But, that's still pretty recent. It's still pretty fresh. And I'd never heard of it. And, nobody I knew had heard of it. These are not things that were talked about. They were left out of public discourse. They were left out of the U.S. education system. And that seemed really important to me, that people knew about this, that this is part of, and it was the tip of the iceberg. So it went a long way towards resolving the dissonance around how the U.S. presented itself as this beacon of freedom and democracy and, all these wonderful values to the rest of the world. And in reality, when you live there, you're aware that money is very much in control, that you are being heavily indoctrinated, and there's not much room to speak out against these things. There's a heavy silencing of dissent. And so going forward from that moment, I wanted to know more. And I went on to learn, even while I was doing the International Baccalaureate, the IB, that was the curriculum at the international school that we were in. I made it part of my mission to find out more about those things. I wrote essays on them. So I learned more and more about what the U.S. was doing in Latin America in particular, and across the rest of the world. This is not limited to the Americas. And I then went on to university, and I went back to the U.S. In the end, it's a long story. I sort of ended up giving myself no other option. But I am glad I did, because certainly at the time, I think this is less the case now, but you really had to specialize if you stayed at a European university. You had to go into one very narrow field, a narrow field within a field, and stay there. And that was what you did. You didn't really do anything else. But I had so many interests that I wanted to pursue. I wanted music, number one, art, number two, and then political science and philosophy, sort of number three. And the university I went to had this like multidisciplinary degree where you could do 2 majors and a minor. And then you also have to take courses in what are called the DEC requirements. It's like categories A through K, I think it was. So loads of courses. So I padded this out with all the things that interested me, film theory and media studies and a lot of U.S. Latin American relations, the geopolitics, just broader political science. And I mean, I did so many things. I always took the maximum course load, and I ended up in a U.S. Latin American relations course with a woman who, I don't know if she was a professor or an associate professor, but she had lived through the junta in Argentina. And I remember that class so vividly because there were all these other American students, kids my age who'd kind of grown up under Reagan and Rambo. And they were sitting there defending Reagan, going like, you calling these bad guys, they're heroes. And she was like, look, this is what happened. I was there. That's the cognitive dissonance right there. And I remember how uncomfortable I felt in that situation. They were attacking her. They were, really just trying to defend what they perceived through no fault of their own, really, through all this indoctrination, what they perceived as their heroes growing up. I was exposed to the same shit. I knew where they were coming from, but they hadn't been through what I'd been through. They hadn't connected and opened themselves up. They hadn't somehow managed to escape that indoctrination. They were fully committed. They were fully turned. I don't want to use the term brainwashed, but it essentially is that. If I'm talking about these pivotal moments, momentous periods, epiphanies, formative moments even, the term that gets used a lot here is radicalization. I object very strongly to that word when used inappropriately, as I think it often is, because it's a term that's really designed to control the starting point of the conversation, a much wider conversation, and to frame those who threaten entrenched power structures as extremists. The system we live in is already radically unequal, and it's kept that way by radical means. So to demand equality is to demand a path away from the radical. And these moments that I'm talking about, they're not moments of radicalization, but of realization and resolution. It's like a moment of truth that forces you to step out of your comfort zone and adapt and realign your reality with this new truth. And so these moments resolve a certain amount of cognitive dissonance by revealing the underlying reality of our world a little bit more clearly. Apologies for the interjection. Making this podcast is both time-consuming and expensive, and it would help us greatly if you felt able to support us via our Patreon page at patreon.com/foldfm, as in frequency modulation, Federated States of Micronesia, Fold FM. We've got a couple of different membership tiers, as little as a few dollars, a few pounds a month, and it would really, really help us to both keep this podcast going and expand it. So if you're getting something out of this, if you feel like our work resonates with you, your support would be massively appreciated. And thanks so much to everyone who's already supporting us, including our sister podcast, The Persistence, which we highly recommend you go and check out straight away after this. Now, the second pivotal moment, momentous period, epiphany, I'm really going to have to settle on a term here, aren't I? Let's go with the pivotal moment. The second one was 9/11. So on 9/11, I was living in Brooklyn and working in Manhattan. I worked on the west side in the Star at Lehigh building. It's like a full city block between 11th and 12th Avenues and 26th and 27th Streets. My subway was the F train, and I had to get that into lower Manhattan and transfer, go up, and then get off and walk across a few avenues. So it went right through downtown Manhattan, blocks away from where the World Trade Center used to be. I woke up that morning to my clock radio. I remember hearing the news talking about a plane hitting the World Trade Center. In New York, it wasn't too unusual for small airplanes to get lost in the fog and hit a skyscraper. It happened from time to time. So, I was like, oh, that's messed up. Oh dear. And then a short while later, a second plane has hit the World Trade Center. I was like, wow, what are the odds of that? That's extremely unusual. I hadn't really absorbed any more of the details than that. It's sort of 2 planes had hit the World Trade Center. I was like, there must be something wrong with air traffic control today. So I was already running about somewhere between half an hour and an hour later. I had a shower, ran out. I remember walking out the front door and looking towards Manhattan from street level where you could normally see the World Trade Center, and I could, but it was wreathed in enormous plumes of like dark gray smoke. And I was like, oh boy, this is going to be an interesting day. So I made the short walk to Fort Hamilton Parkway, my subway stop where I got on the F train. Everything seemed kind of normal until we got to Smith and 9th Streets, which is an outdoor platform. It's like an elevated outdoor platform. You couldn't see downtown Manhattan dead on, but you could see the edges of it from where I was on the platform. And they said, everybody out, the train's not going any further. It's only about 5 stops, I think, from Manhattan. So, 10 minutes away. And they said, everybody out. Okay, no trains are running into Manhattan now. And I was like, oh shit, what the hell is going on? So there weren't loads of people. It seemed fairly quiet, I think, for that time. We were all standing around on the platform. Somebody had a radio. I remember them saying, yo, a plane's hit the Pentagon. And I was like, what the fuck? And then somebody was like, there's another one that's been hijacked. It's over Pennsylvania. Like it's been shot down or it's, lost or something. And I was like, oh my God, how big is this? What's the scope of this? What is actually happening here? That was at that moment where I felt like this is World War III. I think anybody in their right mind would have thought that. I was like, okay, it's finally happening. And then Tower 1 collapsed while we were stood there. We didn't see it. We didn't hear it. Somebody just said, Tower 1 collapsed. And we were all thinking, fucking Tower 1 falling over. I do remember thinking in that moment, the tower would have fallen over, not sort of collapsed into its own footprint, which I'm not going to get into now. It's a huge fucking building. It would have taken out several blocks of Manhattan on its own, entire city blocks would have been crushed into bits if that had just toppled over. So, I was thinking that, oh my God, this is like an enormous catastrophe. Holy shit. And then Tower 2 collapsed. And at this point it was like, right, okay, what do I do? We'd been standing there for, 20 minutes, half an hour. I had no idea what to do. Obviously, I wasn't getting into Manhattan. There was no way to get in. I think I contemplated trying to walk over the bridge to maybe go and help, but I wasn't trained in any kind of triage or even CPR or anything, so I wasn't going to be much use. And as it turned out, you couldn't even get in if you wanted to. So my only option was to walk home. There were no trains. Everything was sort of chaos. Nobody knew what to do. And bear in mind, I didn't have access to the internet there. I don't think I even had a phone on me. I might have done, but one of the biggest cell towers was on top of one of the towers. So there was almost no cell service at the time. Yeah, there was almost like a communication blackout. Even landlines, I think some were affected. So I walked home and it started raining ash over Brooklyn, and it was like snow in the heat of the summer. It was bizarre. And then this huge cloud, this plume of ash just hung over a massive chunk of Brooklyn for at least 2 or 3 days as all the debris that had been pulverized and sort of wafted over Brooklyn. And I made it home, and, my brother was there, and he was like, oh, thank God you're all right. We were just sort of in shock, trying to process what happened. And I remember thinking, even on the day, I was messaging people saying, I'm not surprised, because I knew enough about what the U.S. had done and was doing in the rest of the world to not be surprised that something like this could take place. But I immediately started to worry about how it was going to be used to justify things that were even worse. I was like, watch, I'll bet we're going to go and seize resources all across the Middle East. And sure enough, this was carte blanche to demonize the entire Muslim world. It was obvious to me, even on that day, that bad things were going to be done in the name of this event. And that alone gave me pause to be suspicious. Now, like a lot of people, I've spent many decades researching and reading and trying to figure out what the hell happened that day. I'm not going to get into a lot of the speculation, because at the end of the day, I think something very important gets missed, which is the fact that whatever questions we have take nothing away from the neoconservative agenda and how 9/11 was used to advance it. And that's not fringe history. It's really well-documented territory. It's supported by primary sources, insider accounts, and mainstream scholarly analysis. In case you haven't heard of it, look up the Project for the New American Century, the PNAC. This is like the essential starting point. PNAC was a neoconservative think tank whose signatories included Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Jeb Bush, George Bush's brother, and others, who ended up populating the Bush administration. So in 2000, a year before 9/11, they published Rebuilding America's Defenses, which explicitly called for massively increased defense spending, regime change in Iraq specifically, U.S. military dominance across multiple theaters at the same time, permanent military bases all over the Gulf region, control of space and cyberspace as military domains, among other things. So that publication explicitly noted that achieving this transformation would be slow, quote, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor, a statement which would come to cause a great deal of controversy in light of 9/11. So that sentence was written in 2000, and the people who wrote it ran U.S. foreign policy after 2001. That's not a coincidence that can be sort of casually dismissed. The most documented case of exploitation is Iraq. It has to be Iraq. The manipulation of intelligence to justify the Iraq invasion is the clearest, best documented example. You've got the Downing Street memo in 2002, which had British intelligence reporting that in Washington, quote, the intelligence and facts were being fixed around the policy, and that's a primary source document confirming deliberate manipulation. You've got Curveball, the primary source for mobile bioweapons labs, which was known by German intelligence to be unreliable. The CIA was warned. Colin Powell's UN presentation used this intelligence anyway. The Al-Qaeda Iraq connection was definitely manufactured. The 9/11 Commission explicitly found no credible evidence of a collaborative relationship. Despite that, polls showed a majority of Americans believed that Saddam was involved in 9/11. And that was a belief that the Bush administration deliberately cultivated without directly stating it. Then you had Wolfowitz admitting in a Vanity Fair interview that WMDs were chosen as the justification for bureaucratic reasons because it was the one argument everyone could agree on, not because it was necessarily like the strongest underlying rationale. So that's Iraq in a nutshell. Then in Afghanistan specifically, regime change replaced a narrower objective. The stated goal was bin Laden and al-Qaeda, but it rapidly became full nation building and regime change, which served broader strategic goals around Central Asian positioning. Khalilzad's appointment as envoy was extraordinary. This is like a former Unocal consultant. So Unocal is a big energy company, negotiating with the post-Taliban government about a pipeline corridor. This was never really seriously scrutinized by mainstream media either. And then the pivot to Iraq kind of drained Afghanistan of resources before the job was finished, which only makes sense if Afghanistan was always partly instrumental rather than the primary objective. Then, of course, you have the broader domestic exploitation, the Patriot Act, which was introduced within weeks of 9/11, despite being thousands of pages long, clearly not written in those weeks, and handed to Congress with almost no time to read it before it was to be voted on. Surveillance architecture that had been sought and rejected pre-9/11 was passed with minimal scrutiny under emergency conditions. Then the Department of Homeland Security and the reorganization of intelligence services massively expanded executive power and reduced congressional oversight. Torture and detention policy, so like the legal architecture around enhanced interrogation, Guantanamo Bay, and extraordinary rendition, was constructed deliberately to evade domestic and international legal constraints. The Office of Legal Counsel memos were written specifically to provide legal cover for predetermined policy. And then lastly on that one, the authorization for use of military force, the AUMF, was written in intentionally broad language that administrations have used to justify military action in dozens of countries ever since, far beyond anything publicly discussed at the time. And of course, the continuation of the militarization of the police, which had already begun and which only expanded ever more dramatically since 9/11, to almost a Gestapo-like police force in the form of ICE, murdering U.S. civilians perceived as dissenters with virtual impunity. So you have all that going on. I mean, that's just a very quick summary of the finer points. This isn't going to be a full 9/11 episode. We might do one in future. This is about what was actually done in the name of 9/11 and the ways in which it was exploited by the Bush administration, ways that were truly callous and deliberately obfuscating. So in terms of what was actually concealed and how, this concealment sort of operated on several levels. There was the classification of inconvenient intelligence assessments, including the famous 28 pages of the Joint Congressional Inquiry into 9/11 relating to Saudi connections, which remained classified until 2016. You have this sort of deliberate vagueness in general, never directly claiming Saddam had caused 9/11, but consistently mentioning them in the same breath. Controlling the media environment, broadly speaking. So like the embedding of journalists, the management of casualty figures, the prevention of images of returning coffins, and then the Office of Special Plans, which is like a parallel intelligence unit set up by Feith and Wolfowitz inside the Pentagon specifically to produce intelligence that supported predetermined conclusions, bypassing normal CIA analytical processes. And of course, last but not least, Dick Cheney's direct pressure on CIA analysts, which was documented by multiple agency insiders, to produce assessments supporting the Iraq al-Qaeda link. Those are just a few examples of what we know was concealed and how. So any sort of honest overall assessment would conclude that the Bush administration used 9/11 to advance a pre-existing neoconservative agenda for Middle Eastern dominance that predated the attacks. They used it to justify the Iraq invasion, using manipulated intelligence, exploiting public trauma and fear. They used it to expand executive power domestically in ways that were previously politically impossible, and to establish permanent military presence across Central Asia and the Middle East, to award enormous defense and reconstruction contracts to connected private interests. And we absolutely have to think about the human toll. The Iraq War alone, it's estimated that between 150,000 and 500,000 plus people lost their lives as a result of the 2003 invasion and subsequent conflict up until the 2010s. Similarly, the war in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2021 resulted in an estimated 176,000 to 212,000 plus total deaths, including over 46,000 civilians. And it left millions displaced. None of this requires believing 9/11 was an inside job. It just requires accepting that a group of ideologically motivated people who had already written down what they wanted to do used a genuine catastrophe to do it, while telling the public a much simpler, more palatable story. And that's arguably the most damning version of events because it is the most thoroughly documented one. It's the one that you can't deny. And it's what often gets buried under an avalanche of misinformation and conspiracy theories around whether or not the collapse of the towers was a controlled demolition, and whether it was a missile or a plane that actually hit the Pentagon, and all these controversies. And in the meantime, you have people asking legitimate questions about what happened, because I read the 9/11 Commission report, and it didn't answer a lot of questions that were very obvious to people who had done a minimal amount of research. The fact that they left so many things out, that they didn't really address, for example, the war games that were happening on that day that nobody wanted to explain until much later, and still didn't really give an adequate explanation as to why that hadn't been mentioned or dealt with. So there were military exercises that day that not only diverted a lot of fighter jets away from the northeastern airspace, there were live exercises of terrorist hijackings. And this was very confusing to air traffic control. Like, they couldn't tell which one was real and which one wasn't. There were actual diversionary things happening that enabled those planes to travel much more freely than perhaps they would have done had those exercises not been taking place that particular day. The fact that they barely mentioned Tower 7, which is only the third skyscraper in history to collapse in its own footprint, and that was barely mentioned by mainstream media too. So they didn't do themselves any favors. They made themselves look like they were concealing something from day one. It was clear that the official version of events was a well-crafted narrative and very limited in scope, and the true picture was a much more complex web. So you have the dissonance around what mainstream media and the government are telling the world, and what was fairly obvious to a lot of people that, things just weren't adding up. The official version of events didn't match the reality well enough. Then on the other hand, you have this military escalation across Central Asia and the Middle East. Of course, people were going to ask questions. People had every right to ask questions. The problem is that, one, you can't make a final conclusion. You have to be able to sit with a lot of questions that'll never have any answers, or may very likely never have any answers, which is difficult for a lot of people. It's still difficult for me. All the evidence that I've seen still can't convict anyone. It can't put anyone in jail. It can't really hold anyone accountable, particularly. Although I do feel like there should have been more investigation into a number of things. Particularly, a forensic investigation should have taken place to determine the cause of the collapse, purely from an engineering safety perspective. But they carted away all of the evidence, all of the rubble, the forensic evidence. It was carted away and disposed of before any investigation took place, which then made it impossible to do so. So again, suspicion. And yeah, the other one for me definitely would be the war games, the military exercises. In terms of the hierarchy of the government and the military, the person in charge of those that day was Dick Cheney. So some effort should have gone into investigating that and explaining it better than they did. They simply said that it was a total coincidence. Then Condoleezza Rice famously said after 9/11 that they had no idea that planes could be used as weapons. And then it turns out that there were numerous exercises of exactly that. So it does not inspire confidence. So yeah, for me, the important thing here with 9/11 is that we don't miss what it was actually used to justify by the Bush administration and subsequent U.S. governments. If we dwell too much on questions that will never be answered, we miss all of that, and we miss how that contributes to where we are today, how it led to the Trump ascendancy, how it led to the erosion of the civil liberties of the North American people. If there are any lessons that we take away from 9/11, it's to look at how government and mainstream media exploit situations like that. And I don't think they should be exploiting them in that way. I think it's disgusting. I think it's abhorrent that that is the natural course of events. And it should stand as a damnation of the people who were in charge and how they conducted themselves. I think it's very likely, because it was so advantageous to the Bush administration in so many ways in terms of what they were planning to do. It's very difficult to look at all the evidence, all the concealment, all of the unanswered questions, and not at least come away with a strong suspicion that either it was a Pearl Harbor and they let it happen on purpose, or they engineered it themselves and it was in fact an inside job. I can't prove it, and so I'm not going to conclude that that definitely was the case until somebody emerges with hard evidence, which is very unlikely. But I will, for the rest of my life, strongly suspect it. And I think that suspicion is healthy to maintain, because keeping in mind both that suspicion and the facts of all the exploitation give me a more realistic picture of what to expect and what should be changed. And it is exactly this kind of callous exploitation, this opportunism, that we need to rail against, because it happens all the time. And if you learn to spot it, that's the first step in knowing how to deal with it and how to defeat it. Look at the way the far right operates throughout the world. The deep state, the billionaire class, and all of their mainstream minion media, whenever there is an event that can further the agenda, they will take it and they will run it to death. As this is really about my own experience, the level of cognitive dissonance that I experienced in the aftermath of 9/11 in my own personal spheres and in relation to society at large was the greatest I've ever experienced, I think, in my life. I could see that things weren't right here, and yet these narratives were being used, the portrayal of the first responders as these heroes of 9/11 who then later couldn't get health care from the government when they developed cancer as a result of the exposure to all those particles in the air, and they couldn't get health care. They were dying of cancer. Some of them had to go to Cuba, these firefighters who famously, defended by Jon Stewart. There's families of 9/11 who have brought multiple lawsuits against the Saudi government who never got closure about why their loved ones died, And at the time, mainstream media and the government were pushing these heroism narratives so hard, and all the American nationalist propaganda, and anybody who asked questions or dared to question those narratives was a traitor, was not patriotic, and almost immediately in the aftermath of 9/11, Muslims were being targeted, and even Sikhs, people don't even know the difference between a Sikh and a Muslim. Anybody who looked vaguely like they were from the Middle East would be targeted. There were beatings, and shops were busted up, and all this kind of shit was happening across the country. And knowing what I knew made me feel incredibly isolated and alienated, really, in U.S. society. And I just wanted to get the fuck out of there. Because I felt like this was going to open Pandora's box. The writing was on the wall as soon as those planes hit the buildings. And here we are. So that, for me, was an absolutely pivotal moment. It drove me out of my own country, effectively. At the same time, the dot-com bubble was doomed to burst anyway, but that just accelerated it, and we all lost our jobs. The company I worked for was gone, effectively. Was reduced down to a skeleton staff by the end of 2001, and I was out of a job. I was on unemployment. Suddenly, the abundance of jobs that had been there was just gone, and I didn't know how to cope with that. I hadn't been a freelancer. It was hard to find work for quite a while. And I foolishly decided to try and make a go of being, full-time music. I didn't know what I was doing and utterly failed at it. And eventually got handed an opportunity to come to London, and I bit that hand off. And I never looked back. I took the first opportunity that came to me to leave the country, and I never moved back. And although in the UK things are moving in a kind of similar direction, it's not the same. It's a very different beast. I seem to be able to manage the cognitive dissonance here better than I could there. I felt completely surrounded by it at all times, to the point where I just didn't even want to go outside. I almost felt like I was behind enemy lines in a weird way. It's hard to explain, because there's a lot of things I love about the country. I know a lot of my family are there. I have a lot of friends there. It is an amazing place, and there's amazing people there going through similar to what I'm going through or went through. Probably more and more now, I think a lot of people have been able to rise above that indoctrination. With the advent of social media in particular, I think whole generations of American people have now managed to overcome it in a way that they hadn't never been able to before. So there are probably a lot more people like me walking around in the United States now than there ever were. And that's encouraging. And I feel for those people. So yeah, not many things in my life could be viewed as more pivotal than that. It changed the course of my life irrevocably. It showed to me in real time in my own life, it hit home 100% what the U.S. is really about, what the deep state is, and what it's trying to do and how it operates. It was the clearest illustration I'd received. And having been there on that day is really important to me. I wasn't actually in Manhattan. I wasn't really there. I wasn't in the thick of it. I was right on the edge of it, though. And I know those things happened for sure. I saw them with my own eyes. I went and looked at it. And when I did, the fires were still burning. I saw what happened. I know what happened. It was real. There's a certain amount of comfort in a weird way, or at least when there's so much doubt and uncertainty about what is a fact anymore, to have had as close to a first-hand experience of that event as one can get without being in the thick of it is a sort of foundational reality for me, I guess. It solidified a lot of things that were theoretical, hypothetical, or academic, abstract, I guess. Seeing it firsthand or experiencing it firsthand in your own life makes it that much more real. So in upcoming episodes, we're going to be talking to more people about their core stories, about their arrival at cognitive dissonance, their experiences of it, how they cope with it, what kind of pivotal moments they experienced, if any. Because, it's always there. It never really stops. But there are these moments, or there can be, that really shift the landscape, that propel you forward. So yeah, thank you for listening, and hope to catch you in the next one. Peace.